I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and associate producer of Poured Over, and today I am so overjoyed to be joined by Susanna Clarke, the author of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, one of my favorite books that I have returned to over the years, Piranesi, another incredible transporting novel, and now The Wood at Midwinter, which is beautiful and lovely and was more than I expected because all I want is more from this universe of Strange and Norrell. So I am so excited that there is more and that we are getting another glimpse into your brain. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jenna. That's very lovely. I will endeavour to keep my brain nice and sparkly and interesting.
I think that no matter what, we're going to get those things because the way that you create this world and these characters that just come alive and are able to play and be interesting and be multifaceted and be sometimes people that I look at the page and go, what are you doing? And sometimes I am so very much on board with all of their choices, and to be able to run the whole gamut of all of that with this incredible, beautiful prose is really something.
Thank you. That's lovely. I mean, for the Strange and Norrell characters, they've been with me a long time. But at this point, I do feel like, particularly Strange and Norrell themselves, they're kind of out in the world. They're doing their own thing, and that's great. That's great. They don't need me anymore, which is rather lovely for an author.
Yes, you've set them up, you've given them what they've got, and now you can say they belong to everyone else. I've sort of stepped away.
They were always two characters who very much did their own thing, and now they can do their own thing. Yeah, very much.
Yes, I feel like that's what they've been waiting for all along. In a way, is to get out there and to make their marks on the world. I wonder if you could just briefly set up The Wood at Midwinter for us, because that's the new piece and that's the one that I think people will be most interested to get a sneak peek into because it is new.
The BBC in the UK is one of the very few places that actually asks people to write short stories. People very rarely. Actually, you have a much stronger market for short stories in the US, but in the UK, it is largely the BBC. And they asked me to write a story to go out, just a little tiny story to go out just before Christmas. And my husband said, well, why don't you just choose something from that you've been working on already? And I had this idea that is part of the Strange and Norrell universe of this character Meredith and her relationship to the natural world and to woods and to animals. And so something quite different, really, than I've spoken about, but than I've written about before. But again, she's been a character that has lived with me for a while. And I thought, well, I could just sort of tell her story quite simply. She feels like a character who is she belongs in the wood. She understands the wood. I think at one point she says a wood is like a church is like a wood. So she's a different sort of character, I think, than appears in a lot of stories, a sort of lost in her own world kind of character. So I said that for Radio 4, for the BBC Radio 4, and it went out just, I think, the day before Christmas Eve a couple of years ago. And now it's the sweetest little book with the most wonderful illustrations by Victoria Sorden. And when Strange and Norrell came out 20 years ago, it was very unusual for a book to be illustrated. So we sort of come a bit full circle with this. This time nobody asked me whether I wanted it illustrated. They just did it anyway. But it was very, very unusual, I think, at that point. And when I suggested it to the publisher, I thought they were just going to say, oh, no, we're not going to do that. So I was slightly astonished when they said yes for Strange and Norrell. But I wanted it very much, that book, to feel like you picked up a Dickens with those 19th century novels that were illustrated. because I felt that the illustrations in Dickens were so much part of the experience and gave you extra atmosphere that was something I wanted to do. But I was completely astonished that they said yes.
Revisiting Strange and Norrell now, sort of as an adult versus having read it when I was younger, I probably was, oh gosh, maybe 16 or 17 the first time I read it. And to come back to it, I remember opening the book for the first time and experiencing the illustrations and the footnotes and thinking, this is a book unlike anything I have seen before. And I feel like it was one of the first times I ever saw footnotes like that in a novel. And I loved the experience of going through and matching up sort of these myths and stories along with. And I just remember having such a great reading experience. And now to go back, where I think many people have done footnotes now, and maybe they had at the time too, more contemporary, but I hadn't seen it. And now being like, yes, this is something that really, I love form in a novel and playing with what we see as a standard novel.
It was very much something when I was writing Strange and Norrell. I mean, I didn't have a contract. It took me a very long time, but the footnotes particularly was something that I wrote for myself because I have a brain that just goes off down rabbit holes constantly, that goes down any little windy path in the wood, and I'm kind of there. So trying to write a straight narrative, I can do it, but I have to keep forcing myself. So the footnotes were a way to kind of let off steam, really, or you could have a little story just jotting off it, and that was very much what I wanted to do. And I sort of, because it's set in the 19th century, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Strange and Norrell is set in the 19th century, but there's a sort of medieval plot behind the 19th century one. There's a sort of glimpses. You keep glimpsing this medieval world. And the footnotes particularly allowed me to kind of just like little tiny illustrations in the margins of a medieval manuscript. They were sort of just gave you a little picture of a different world beyond the one which is in the main text, the 19th century world, which the characters all think of as very, very modern to them and sort of rather commonplace and a bit, it's the boring modern world. And they're looking back, as we look back to the 19th century, they're looking back to a previous time. And I think it's important in fantasy that there's always a kind of depth, a kind of world behind the world that's a bit that you're always kind of trying to get to, where things were different and maybe slightly more magical, that's just sort of there in the background. So the footnotes helped a lot with that.
They definitely added a depth. As someone who, as I read, I consider myself something of a rabbit hole reader, where if there's something in a book that sort of piques my interest, I'm like in Google, I'm searching, I'm trying to find the information. I always want to be going to like putting in as much as I'm getting back from a book. And so something like those footnotes, even though maybe they're not actual historical things I could Google, but I will try, they give me that sense of depth, like you said, that I really love.
The internet has made things quite difficult for readers like you and me, because we're constantly putting the book down and going off and researching things. I think there's a lot of actual history. I believe there's a lot of actual history in Strange and Norrell. I researched it a lot because you try and build up as far as you can the real world, so that when you start bringing the magic in, the magicians in, and the magic that they're doing, and the history, which never quite happened, although sometimes I kind of almost believe that it did. When you start bringing these things, you've got this very real framework that you can slot it into. So hopefully the reader can't quite see the seams, the joins. That was the idea.
Here in the US, we don't learn that much about the Napoleonic Wars. So to me, that is my truth, is the version of it that I read in Strange and Norrell.
Yes. And I get confused. I must admit, between what I invented and what actually happened. But I always think that however wonderful your imagination, sort of these historical facts and things, they're very often stranger. I think there's a detail which happened at the Battle of Waterloo about a man walking round who'd gone to sell buttons to people. He was the sales rep basically from a British company, and he'd gone to Belgium to sell buttons. And he ended up wandering around, and I think he's real. I think it must have been very grim. It was a horrible battle, but they did go, which I don't think anybody would think of doing nowadays. Everybody would stay well clear.
Yes, I think there's sort of this kind of fantasy, speculative, based in reality, gives us this chance to sort of look back on these events and take those incredible details that did happen, but just tweak them in ways where it's like, what if? We don't know. In certain ways, though, the history is, different. It reminds me of reading The Bright Sword by Lev Grossman, which recently came out, which is sort of a King Arthur retelling. And just those moments where it's like, well, we don't know. It could have been like this.
Yeah, yeah. I haven't read the Lev Grossman, but I know Arthur is such a rich seam of stories. And also he was one of the original, the Arthur stories were one of the original tales which were constantly retold throughout hundreds of years. And at each stage they meant something slightly different depending on who had got hold of the narrative at that point. So, yeah, we should have one for the modern age, absolutely.
I think, and there are those moments in Strange and Norrell too, where it comes into who is in charge, who is in power, and what are they doing with it. And I think we've always turned towards storytelling and often magic and myth to sort of reckon with who is in power and who is in charge of what we're doing.
So, around the edges of Strange and Norrell, you have the women, and you have Stephen Black, who is the son of an African who was born on a ship, not actually a slave ship, I don't think, but who was born on a ship and whose mother was an African slave and he never knew her. So you have this person with an African background in London, as there were many black servants in Britain at the time. And so you've got these people from different viewpoints looking on at the men of England in their position of privilege and power. So you have got these different viewpoints. And in a way, I quite like the fact that Strange and Norrell never really know any of this is going on, or barely. They just sort of continue down there, we're gentlemen, so this is what we do. We're in control of the magic. We have our friends in Parliament. We have our friends who are aristocrats. And they never really see these stories which are going on around the edges, which actually have a huge influence on the way that the story resolves. But they're completely oblivious to it, which kind of makes sense to me.
It does. If you're reading back and you think, what if we took out, not only just for the story, but if we're saying in the sense of things, if you had taken out Arabella, if you had taken out Lady Pole, if you had taken out Stephen Black, I think Strange and Norrell would have been sorely dissatisfied with the way things had gone for them.
Yes. They were affected in so many ways by people that they couldn't see. I always love stories in which you can see that the characters have only got part of the story, that there's another part of the story carrying on. There's a very old, I think it might be a Scottish fairy tale, in which a man is standing by a river and a sort of supernatural, like a mermaid, but I think a different kind of being, a female supernatural character, rises up in the river and cries out, "The hour is come, but not the man." then moments later, a rider rides up to the river and a man throws himself in. That is all you get. That is the entire story. So what the story is behind, you never understand. But things like that that makes my skin tingle. I like layers very much. So I like the fact that Strange and Norrell don't know everything. In fact, very often they don't know the main thing that's going on.
And even when you have characters like I would say maybe my two favorite characters in the universe, which would be Vinculus and Childermass, who often are saying directly to them, this is what is happening. Still nothing.
Yeah. No, I think Childermass was a revelation because he was a very small character. Sometimes you can see this. You can see it in Dickens, actually. He'll put a small character in at the beginning and suddenly he'll realize, oh, wait a minute, this is the main person. And that very much was what happened. Enzo Cilenti, who played the Childermass in the television series, he once said in an interview that he felt he was playing the main character. And I must admit, I almost agree with him. Childermass is just, yeah, I love Childermass. He was the character who surprised me. He was also, I found in both Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell and in Piranesi, both of them, there was one character who would just turn up and do their scene, and it was no trouble. It was like they were almost dictating to me. All I had to do was just type fast enough to keep up with them. They were no trouble at all. And in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, that character was definitely Childermass. And in Piranesi, weirdly, it was the prophet, who is not a particularly nice character. It's very different. But he was, again, he just sort of, and he only really has one scene, but he sort of strode onto the stage, as it were. And all I had to do was just type fast enough to keep up with him. I love characters like that.
And your works are so filled with these incredible characters, even from, the largest Jonathan Strange, Mr. Norrell, the, 800 and some page behemoth, down to The Wood at Midwinter, which has these lovely characters that even though we only get a short time with them, we feel like we know them. When you're creating some of these works, do you find that characters are one of the first things that come to you? Do you sort of hear these voices as you begin to tell the story, or is it more of a bigger picture and working down?
It's a good question, and I think it varies very much. I think Mr. Norrell did sort of just appear and I think the similarly true is really, Strange developed perhaps a bit more. They both developed, but I sort of knew their kind of the colour of them in a way, the colours of their personalities and their outline. But that's not always the case. And in Piranesi, I struggled a lot, both with the character of Piranesi and very much with the character of the other. It took me a long time to get both of these right. With the character Piranesi, I tried at first to make him quite cross because, why wouldn't you be? He's on his own. He's having to fend for himself. He's having to fish. He has nothing except what he can sort of find: water, fish. It's not a very varied diet, let's face it. So at first I thought he'd be kind of difficult and cross. And I tried to write him that way and it just wouldn't work. And it was only when I realised, no, he's not cross at all. He loves being there. That I thought, oh yeah, finally, now I understand him. But it took a while. So it depends. It depends quite a lot. I have both experiences. Meredith in The Wood at Midwinter, she was always the way she is. She does remind me, only a little bit of my dad, who once said to me, I know that other people aren't interested in the things that I'm interested in. For him, it was mathematics, dates, church history. For Meredith, it's walking in the woods and animals and praying, I guess. It's not a sort of usual protagonist, I think, for this day and age. But she's almost shaped, formed by the wood. It wasn't too difficult to find her voice, I think.
The connections that she has with the animals and with the nature around her, I think is so interesting because it does feel sort of a different pace than we would expect, not only just from someone living today, but from maybe a protagonist that we would encounter, because she's just not interested in the human world, it seems. Like she has her rich world, but it is entirely separate from those around her. And even sort of the way she thinks about her sister and her family, it's not unkind and it's not, cruel, but yet it is so separate and so specific. And it was interesting to sort of get that glimpse inside her head to see, oh, this is someone who is living differently.
Yes. I think the nearest to her is probably St. Francis, who I think gets a tiny little mention right at the end. Someone who just cannot see much difference between animals and people. She has a bit of a similarity, a connection to Piranesi, in that the world as it is given just seems so marvelous to her, and what she focuses on are woods and animals. His world is very different, but it also seems, despite being quite bleak in many ways and demanding, because, as I say, he's got to find fish to eat, but it's what he's given is wonderful and a sign of knowing that he is loved and blessed, and he keeps that is at the forefront of his mind always.
It makes it a joy to sort of go through and read. And I loved the little voices, the little characters of the animals as well, that all had their distinct personalities. There's a pig in there that I was a big fan of. And to just sort of encounter each voice.
I have to tell you, the pig is here. I have the pig and the fox, actually. They're with me always. I won't show them because they're a bit raggy. And so you'll just have to take my word for it. But they do sit beside me while I'm writing. And the pig gives me advice on what to say. But mostly there should be more pigs in this. So,
Sure. That's sometimes good advice and sometimes might seem a little biased, but you're like, I'm writing my space opera. We can't have pigs in this one.
I think pigs would be good in a space opera.
I agree. I think that there is such an interesting relation that we as people have to the natural world. And, I feel like it's such a constant sort of battle now, this sort of, how do we reconnect? How do we reclaim? And to see someone who just is and just has that innately, even though it is a different time when perhaps you could argue maybe it was easier for her in her circumstances and her lifetime. But I think it is something comforting for many of us to imagine that sort of connection to nature and the magic within it. I mean, I think that is often the closest we can get to magic in our world, is to immerse ourselves in nature.
Yes. And I think that is a thread that follows through Jonathan Strange and Wood at Midwinter, this little tiny sliver, because you have got, when you're trying to think of, well, what is magic? Where does it come from? For me, it must come to some extent from the landscape. So English magic would come from the English landscape, which is particularly, because I live in the north and have tended to live throughout my life in among northern landscapes. So I sort of position it there, although there are many other kinds of magical landscapes within England. And then, Wales and Scotland are incredibly beautiful too. So but I think it must, that's where it comes. Interestingly, I've been rereading some books that I read as a child. I was a big fan of Rosemary Sutcliff, who was I think she was what they called a children's author in the mid 20th century. So she was kind of what I read as a child. But her stories tended to be set in Roman Britain, and then a bit later in the sort of very early medieval world. And I think occasionally a bit further back. But because they're these quite stark stories, but very much they have this connection to the English landscape. So you've got the British religion that the Romans kind of replaced or had at least to deal with, which is very much about landscape. It has to be. That's what there is. And I think that kind of had an influence on me, that the most magical thing is hills and trees. And I think it's, for me, it's about what's interesting in magic is what is beyond the human. And that, again, I think is in all three things, both Jonathan Strange, Mr. Norrell, Piranesi, and Wood at Midwinter, that you get beyond the sort of concerns of the ego. And that's where you will find magic. You'll find a sense of presence there. That's quite important to me.
It is sort of this thing that I find when reading your work and other things that are, invoke that same feeling, that idea that the magic is there, whether we are interacting with it or not, it is happening, and we find these places to tap into it and to accept it and to incorporate it. And for better or worse, sometimes I think there are definitely moments in Strange and Norrell where things are used, in ways that we wouldn't hope, or that, things are sort of misconstrued and misshapen to create these other things. But there are yet these moments of beauty and sort of otherworldly intervention that go beyond what they're trying to create or shape for themselves.
No, that's a very good point. Within the magic of Strange and Norrell, some of it is certainly about power, and you see that, and it's the magic that Strange and Norrell are doing is about power and things being done according to the convenience of humans in the 19th, of English humans in the 19th century. But behind that lies this older, deeper magic, which is about landscape. And as you say, which is there whether or not we're aware of it. There's the idea in Celtic religion, both Celtic pre-Christian religion and Celtic Christianity. There's this idea of the thin places, that there are particular places where heaven and earth are particularly, close together, where you can almost break the veil, kind of thing. And although that's not specifically what I'm talking about, that idea, I think, is quite, I find that quite interesting and quite fruitful.
And it does, I think, it feels in some ways, as we're talking about this power and this nature and connection, it's interesting to me in sort of comparing the ways in which Meredith is able to connect, perhaps as a woman, versus Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell as these men in this society that has crafted them to be what they are. It is an interesting comparison to go through. And I think the way that they've sort of accepted and sort of Meredith sort of exists in this world. There's not a lot of preconceiving about what she's trying to get, though she does sort of get something, I guess, in the end. But, Strange and Norrell are always about what they can get. And maybe for even Mr. Norrell, this sort of fear of tapping into what he knows may be there and maybe getting more than he's bargained for.
That's very interesting. It's Strange and Norrell are part of a system. They are part of the way England was run in the early 19th century by by gentlemen some of whom went to Parliament, some of whom were very powerful in their local areas, but it was a system, it was a class system, and they are part of the ruling class. And therefore, it makes sense to them to use magic in order, not exact, I don't think they quite see it as benefiting their class, although that's what happens, but they would see it as benefiting England because this is the way that things are done. And so it's a sort of version of England as it actually was at that time. But there's also, in Norrell particularly, there's this fearfulness. He knows that there's a sort of stronger, deeper magic, and I think part of him longs for it, but he's a very nervous, anxious, fearful sort of person. Then he kind of wants to protect himself and England from it. And I think half of his neuroses, which are many, sort of come from that. Whereas Meredith, you're right, she's not really about what she wants to gain at all. She just wants to live in the most authentic way. And I think some of it does come from being a woman, but not consciously. She's not sort of thinking, I'm doing this. She's just thinking, I'm doing this because I'm me. She does gain something in the end, but that gain, it's arguable whether that gain is more a gain or a sacrifice, I think.
I agree. I also think that perhaps Norrell's biggest worry at any time is protecting his books, which I can relate to.
Well, I think Norrell is, in many ways, he's a terrible man, but I think he's a man a lot of us include, is definitely me. Most writers can relate to him. Childermas, quite early on in the book, at one point, forces him to go to a party which he really doesn't want to go to, and he just Norrell just says, "I want to go home and read a book." Which is about me at most social situations, really.
Absolutely. Between that and the constant of, well, but I was going to write that. What do you mean someone else is writing a book? I was going to write a book.
Yes.
That really struck. And sometimes you go to a party and you meet people that are awful and that are going to be in your life for a long time and cause you a lot of problems, like Norrell and some
That's true.
Gentlemen he encounters.
That's true. It's arguable whether, in fact, perhaps he would have been better off if he had never gone to that party. That's very, very true.
It does go into, I think, again, this sort of outsider and insider aspect that comes up often of you can be both at the same time, I think, and that comes through in Strange and Norrell as well, that sometimes you are both an outsider and an insider, depending on the situation. And I think for Meredith as well, in many ways, she is an outsider, and yet to herself, in this world she sort of crafted for herself, she is the insider there.
She's an outsider, and what she does, I think, is this sort of tremendous thing, but it's quite mysterious and it's quite frightening. But it takes us a step forward, and she can only really do it because she doesn't think like other people, because she is, as you say, an outsider. And in a way, that's also true of Norrell. He can reestablish magic because he spent years sitting in a library on his own, and Childermas more or less has to prize him out of it. But that dedication and that constantly retreating to be with his books is what enables him to bring back English magic.
I love that. Do you miss, I know you said they're kind of off in the world and doing their own thing, but do you ever miss Strange and Norrell and just kind of wonder what they're up to and what they're doing? I feel like as I finish the book, I'm like, I know they have so many adventures still in there, and I just wonder what's going on. And I hope that some of the other characters like Arabella and Flora and Stephen Black, I just hope they're okay.
I think I think probably they're better off without Strange and Norrell. Yeah, I do miss the characters. It's still a world which is very much part of my imagination, but they are off on they're doing their own thing, I think. When they filmed the television series, which was, I think, around about 2015, I was invited up to see some of the filming. And one night they said that the producer and everything, they said, we'll show you the production office, which was just a very normal office in Leeds, which is a city in the north of England. And when we got there, there was this car park in front, and there was a parking space, and there was a big sign saying parking space for Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Oh, but they don't even drive. It was just such an extraordinary thing. They get up to all sorts, it seems to me.
They certainly do. I think there's lots of characters in there that have had their fair share of adventures that may be left to the imagination only.
We shall see. We shall see. I mean, it's still a world that I do long to go back to very much. But it's also it's a big, complicated thing. And I think, as you know, I've had a long years of illness. When I'm ready to tackle this, which I hope will happen. I hope will happen.
When you're ready, we will be ready. We are patient and we can wait. But
that's very, very kind. Very kind.
I would love to talk a little bit about your sort of literary influences and things that inspire you as a reader and as a writer, some things you love.
Well, I've mentioned Rosemary Sutcliff. I hadn't forgotten her, but sometimes I find that sometimes I go back to something that I read when a much earlier stage, and I think this was why this made such a big impact on me. Or here is possibly the source of this, something that I've tried to do in my own writing. And one of the things that has interested me a lot about Sutcliff, reading her again, is that she wrote this very famous book called The Eagle of the Ninths, in which a young man who's Roman and his friend who's British go from England into the Highlands of Scotland on this very dangerous mission. And this is the point at which the Romans have come into Britain and conquered it. So there are all these Roman forts, Roman soldiers, and people who are not quite under the Roman rule yet. They have not really submitted. They get along with the troops, more or less, but from time to time there's an uprising. She does it without moralizing. She doesn't say these people are right, these people are wrong. The center of this book is friendship. These two are loyal to each other. Both points of view. She admires seemingly the Roman soldiers for their discipline and their way of life. But she also admires the British people. And I like that lack of moralizing or finding the moral center in loyalty and friendship. I've just found that quite refreshing. And I kind of think that is something I've rather carried through my life. And I wonder if you kind of look at that and think, I wonder if I got that from her, because I was probably at a very impressionable age when I first read her.
That does feel a lot like Strange and Norrell in a lot of ways, that there is this sort of, perhaps they're sometimes on two sides and of two schools of thought, and yet they cannot in many ways exist without each other. And there's this pull and loyalty that returns to them even when they've struggled through it.
Yeah, I hope so. Because there was, despite the fact that they're both difficult characters in different ways, and they spend a lot of the book being enemies. They also spend a lot of the book being friends. And you get the feeling that, irritating as Norrell is, they are bigger and better together than they are apart. And Strange quite honestly says at one point, even if I am Norrell's enemy, in a way he formed me. I am what my training made me. So, I'm very interested in Sutcliffe's books at the moment. The other big influence, well, one of the big influences on Strange and Norrell is obviously Jane Austen. I was, particularly at the beginning, I went to her constantly for the sort of relationships between men and women, the relationships between, which are very subtly done in her books, between servants and masters, this sort of rather familial way of being, rather than probably later in the 19th century, a very hierarchical way of being. And Dickens as well, I've mentioned. And one of the big influences on Piranesi was Borges, the Argentinian writer, was completely different. He wrote these sort of pristine, very, very, very short stories, jewel-like and very strange, which I absolutely loved. So this was my attempt to write a Borges story as a novel, which he never did, which is a very strange, which when you read his stories, it's a very strange idea to try and do that. But I like to do mad things.
And we like to read them. I think I mean, what better thing to get to do than to take what may be a crazy idea and be like, I'm going to turn this into a book. And everyone else will just have to buckle up and hope for the best.
It does mean that you go through the entire writing process thinking nobody's going to understand what I'm talking about. Nobody. But which is a bit hairy at times.
And then you get a book like Strange and Norrell, which 20 years later is still beloved by so many.
So extraordinary, but wonderful. Yeah. Nobody is more amazed than me.
It is such a joy to get to return to those books and to return to the depth. And I mean, I know reading it this time I found things that I'm sure I didn't before. And if I go again and go back through, I'll find even more things. I actually had a very good time employing the audiobook this time as well to even add more depth. It was such a fun time to get that full experience.
Isn't it wonderful? Absolutely.
It is so fun. And I can't wait for people to get their hands on The Wood at Midwinter and to jump back into this fantastical world that you've created and to see the joys of Meredith and that natural world.
I always like to put a bit of snow in a book, and there's plenty of snow in Wood at Midwinter, as well as animals and woods.
It's I mean, I don't want to say it's magical, but it's magical.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today and for talking about this incredible work that you've done. I can't wait for people to come back to Strange and Norrell and to find Wood at Midwinter as well.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much, Jenna.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.